Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Flourish FM, a podcast for the good life. Our guest today is Dr. Federica Amati. Federica is a postdoctoral medical scientist and public health nutritionist committed to advancing our understanding of nutrition and lifestyle interventions for optimal health. She holds a Ph.D. in clinical medicine research from Imperial College London, where her work focused on the gut microbiome and its impact on human health. She focuses in particular on maternal and early childhood health, emphasizing the first 1,000 days of life, women's health, and the role of nutrition in improving health outcomes. Federica is currently a research associate at Imperial College London's School of Public Health and nutrition lead at Imperial's School of Medicine. Beyond her academic work, Federica is head nutritionist at Zoe, a health science company leveraging data-driven insights to empower individuals to achieve better health outcomes through personalized nutrition. At Zoe, she contributes her expertise in nutrition science to help develop innovative solutions that translate cutting-edge research into practical dietary recommendations. Federica's recently published book, Everybody Should Know This: The Science of Eating for a Lifetime of Health, outlines how to eat for best health at each life stage. With a passion for public health, Federica has made a real difference to both individual and community health. In this episode, we discuss what are the most important factors about nutrition to support human thriving and how nutrition supports human flourishing at various stages across our lifespan. And key conversation points are the fundamentals about nutrition that we all need to know, how to improve our health span as well as our lifespan, Federica's groundbreaking research on how to thrive across the different stages of life that impact nutrition, which she describes as the biggest windows of opportunity that human development offers us, the key moments where our physiology, metabolism, and needs for certain foods change, and why ultra-processed foods are bad for our health, and strategies we can employ to consume far fewer ultra-processed foods, despite them being so readily available and well marketed. It's a fascinating conversation packed with research-backed practical insights, and we hope you love it. So this is what everybody should know about nutrition and flourishing with Dr. Federica Amati. Federica, how are you doing?
So good. Thank you so much for having me, John. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for your team sending me a wonderful book. Everybody Should Know This: The Science of Eating for a Lifetime of Health, which I can't wait to dig into today with you. So this book describes the exciting power that food has for best health and to help us thrive throughout each stage of life.
Yeah.
Now, many of us don't tend to think about how our nutrition and diet should change over our lifetimes, except perhaps for differences between infancy, adolescence, and adulthood, and perhaps some changes later in life based on maybe health conditions. So could you please give us an overview of the different stages of life that impact nutrition?
Yes, I think we'll start by saying that nutrition impacts us at all stages. So
Right.
in a way, what we eat today impacts how we'll feel today and tomorrow. So it really impacts us in a very short-term, immediate, consequential way. But also there are specific developmental phases in life, for sure, that offer opportunities to deepen our understanding of nutrition and to really embrace the power that food can have to help us through those transition points or those developmental milestones. So there's a sort of day-to-day effect, what I like to refer to as the compound interest effect of daily food choices. So what we choose to eat every day in the long term will have a compound effect. But also when we look at these specific phases of life, there's a real opportunity to have a big impact on that health account, shall we say. So, and I guess the biggest one, and the one that has the most research, is the first 1,000 days of life. So that's from conception to second birthday. There's a bit of a blurred line around those days because really preconception care is incredibly important. And when we're talking about impacting, for example, maternal health status, we really are wanting to target preconception care. So before a woman becomes pregnant, getting her to that, optimal status is really important. And then on the other side, from the age 2 to 3 years, there's still a massive amount of brain development and cognitive development that's taking place. But for the sake of the beautiful wording of first 1,000 days, there's lots of research on this and how our dietary choices, but also exposures to stress and exposures to other environmental factors have a really important effect on our long-term health and on our risk factors of future health problems or future good health. So that's the first. And there's another one which I think is sort of fairly overlooked, actually, and that's in middle childhood. So thinking ages sort of 5-ish to 8. Children at this time go through a lot of changes, especially with their lymphoid tissue, which is the tissue that's responsible for carrying our immune system cells around. And they also go through major changes in some of the tissues, so like skeletal muscle tissue. And it's an opportunity again to revisit how our children are eating. They're often at school at this time, and it can be quite overlooked as a period of intervention. Then there's teenage sort of puberty. So when girls start their periods and boys start going through the sexual hormone changes, this is such a critical time. You know, it's almost obvious to say, but supporting children at this stage, or young adults at this stage in their lives, is critical for lots of reasons. First of all, to make sure that they go through puberty in a way that it's always going to be quite a big impact on a person's life, but we can support that transition. And when we look at girls specifically, this is where we start to see the onset of iron deficiency anemia. Now, iron deficiency anemia is actually a really big public health problem. And it's not particularly spoken about widely. But I think people kind of know that iron's important, but by some estimates by the World Health Organization, we're looking at between 40 and 55% of girls are iron deficient. Now, the thing with iron deficiency is that often the initial symptoms aren't particularly severe, and they can be, especially in teenagers, they can be sort of overlooked as just being a bit moody or grumpy or tired because they're teenagers, right? But because girls start menstruating at this time, so they start to lose blood with every cycle, it's where if there hasn't been a good iron status in childhood, it will tip into a deficiency. And it's really important that we get ahead of that before it becomes ingrained, not least because it impacts development. It impacts cognitive ability. So these children are doing exams, they're at school, lots of pressure, and being iron deficient does not support that at all. And also when we think about their long-term health, you know, if those sort of iron deficient teens go on to become iron deficient adults, they are at higher risk of pregnancy complications, of not being able to become pregnant. So it's such a simple thing to think about as an intervention, and it's really warranted. And with boys, we don't have the same problem with iron deficiency, but we do see that as they go through puberty, their needs change, and actually supporting their mental well-being and their physical well-being does require like really micronutrient-rich foods. And unfortunately, we know that in the US and in the UK, teens are the population group that are at highest exposure to ultra-processed foods and are most likely to consume the vast majority of their calories as ultra-processed foods. So we're looking at sort of 70% of their calorie intake from ultra-processed foods. And, you know, ultra-processed foods are almost all devoid of sort of nutrient density. So then once we move past puberty into early adulthood, we have this opportunity to make the most of the physical and metabolic flexibility that we have at this age. It's also the early 20s is when our brain structure starts to really settle and become who we are. So this is where, if you imagine an early childhood neuroplasticity is like insanely amazing. You form a neuron for everything you experience. That starts to focus in middle childhood. And then teenagers, there's this, what used to be referred to as synaptic pruning, but it's really just this reinforcing of the synaptic pathways. So the repeated pathways that we use, whether it's language or maths or music, the things that we really get to know. And then it's really in the early 20s that map is kind of quite set. Of course, we still have ability to introduce neuroplasticity later in life, but it's a really important time for our brains. So I always think we need to look after our brains in our early 20s. And there's no surprise then that when we look at risk-taking behavior at this age is like pretty high. It's when people are most likely to drink alcohol, smoke, possibly take recreational drugs, and all of these, not all of them, but the majority have neurotoxic effects, especially alcohol. So there's things we can really do to help ourselves and our kids or grandkids at this age by empowering them with that knowledge of that important structural change. So then we go to like 30s, and when we look at the 30s, there's two broad groups of people, 30s to now early 40s, the way sort of demographics are changing. But what we're looking at adults who want to have a family, so fertility is a concern for them or something that they're interested in, and then those adults that don't. And to be honest, the advice for both groups is fairly similar in terms of how to achieve a good nutritional status and the importance of establishing behaviors that will support like later adulthood, because typically it's also when there will be a lot of career pressure, so a lot of demands in terms of work as well as possibly family, and looking after ourselves and not relying too much on our stress resilience, which can be quite good at this age. And so people can tend to push themselves really hard and not support their health and nutrition. And if we haven't got like a good foundation at this age of a healthy dietary pattern and regular, I have to say, like regular movement throughout the day is so important as well. And for those who are really looking to optimize their metabolic health, building muscle mass is going to be a hell of a lot easier at this age than it is later in life. So those are the kind of another key little nugget of time. And then we get to sort of 50. So this midlife transition. For women, there's a really marked change with the menopause, and the research on that is growing. I'm really excited, actually. At Zoe, we have a huge piece of research that we're sort of we've presented at academic conferences, and now we've created a brand new tool for women to be able to use free of charge to understand their menopausal status, which is really exciting. So the research is growing great. And for men, really, I work with a lot of men one-on-one in this age bracket, in this sort of midlife, and it's just reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease is such a massive red flag at this age, especially for men who have perhaps not had a good dietary pattern, drunk a bit too much, worked out a bit too hard, if you know what I mean. So that is this pattern of very high performance at work, incredibly long hours, then going to a very high intensity class, not getting enough sleep, drinking alcohol. Like the whole combination of those things really leads to increased risk of cardiovascular disease markers. And so it's sort of slightly different approach at this stage. Again, you diverge a bit. Men and women have slightly different needs for different reasons. So with menopause, we know it's this huge change. It's like a real it's not a gradual change, it's like a sudden thing. And so it's a different approach, how to prepare for that and how to help women manage that transition. Whereas for men, it's really looking at the chronic habits that have built up that may be negative over the past sort of 5 to 10 years. And then how can we untangle that? Because you can make a huge impact in your 40s and 50s and massively reduce your risk.
So just before we go on to the next stage, actually, because there's so many things I want to ask you here, but just ask about something there. That was interesting what you said then, that it's common that men, particularly around in that age group, midlife, they're doing the high intensity fitness classes, or at least that's become a growing trend. Yet, because that's incorporated into a lifestyle of working very long hours and not sleeping sufficiently and drinking alcohol, that's actually increasing cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, so this is not to say that. So of course, exercise is brilliant, but there's essentially the theory of inflammaging, which is like the fancy word for it, but it's this idea that if you have a very high stress job, so you have a chronic stress in your workplace, you also have a high stress lifestyle, so poor sleep, perhaps your sleep pattern also is off, so you sleep at different times on the weekends compared to the weekdays. We term this social jet lag, where you have very different sleep patterns. And then you couple that with maybe alcohol drinking, and the only form of exercise that you do is very high intensity cardiovascular, like training. The end result is that you're chronically stressing your body. Now, where high impact training is a beneficial stressor that can then result in a rebound where inflammation actually goes down. In the context of a lifestyle that's entirely high stress, if that's the only form of exercise you're doing, it's actually not going to counteract this massive bit of stress over here. So the advice is not so much to reduce exercise, but it's have a look at whether incorporating like a walk into work, a walk home from work, maybe one class a week, which is more restorative. So whether that's yoga or swimming or something that moves your body but has less of a high intensity element to it, seems to be much better for like inflammatory profile, essentially.
Right.
And again, there's a difference there between men and women. So whereas and Dr. Stacey Sims is like, for me, the queen of this. She's spent her life researching these differences. And when she talks about the difference between men and women, it's also this idea that with women, actually, high impact training is really helpful for our bone density, but it's in short bursts.
Yeah.
Whereas zone 2 training, which is like walking with a weighted vest or intense walking, really benefits men for their cardiovascular health. So it's about finding the combination of things that really helps with your physiology, but knowing that if you are one of these men, especially who fall into a category of like work hard, play hard, train hard, don't sleep, that's not going to be a good combination, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. At any age, and I assume that's at any age, but it's particularly risky there because maybe in your 20s the body can recover more quickly.
Yeah, I think certainly if you're doing that in your 20s, you haven't had the chronic stress accumulation from the past decade. So you're more likely to recover quickly, of course, and have like your body has had less wear and tear in terms of sustaining chronic stress. Sustaining chronic stress is really depleting. So it's about where you've come from and what stage you're at. So that's why. But when you see, and I do see this a lot, women in their midlife who have exactly this pattern of behavior, and their metabolic health is not good.
Yeah, I used to actually go to an intense fitness class 5 to 6 days a week at 5 o'clock in the morning in Boston before I realized this wasn't on balance great for my health because I wasn't sleeping that much because I'm not really a morning person. And I mean, I won't name the organization, but I was even told later by one of the receptionists, the staff there, was like, we're advised to sell this full time to people, but actually we don't think you should be doing it that often, like that intensely every single day. It's probably not that good for your health and balance. Maybe 2 to 3 times a week. Actually.
And listen, it's the same with anything. Variety is key, right? So it's the same with if you find a really lovely meal that you love, that's great, but you shouldn't eat it every single day. Because different forms of movement and exercise offer different benefits. And if you're doing the same thing, and listen, I love this class, which I think we're talking about, right? I've been there, I do it. I might have some credits, in fact, but it's not something to do every day. And it's also something that I wouldn't do if I was sleep deprived. And it's something that I wouldn't do if I've had a particularly stressful week, because you've got to balance things out somewhere. So it's in the same way that people who only ever practice yoga might lack on cardiovascular fitness. You've got to have a good balance of moving our bodies in different ways. And there's some really cool like emerging trends at the moment of functional movement. There's like a big move. There's a big one in Ibiza. The name is called like primal moves or something. And
primal moves. Okay.
I think it's called something. I think it is called that. But literally in the class, you crawl on all fours and you move your body in new ways and challenge your physical structure to like actually adapt. And it's that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's not for everyone to do private moves, but like making sure that we are doing things that challenge us in different ways, which will keep us healthy to do different things. Because when we think about fitness, it's often what's our goal, right? Certainly it makes us feel good. So like there's plenty of science to show that moving your body, especially things like dancing, really improve mental health. So for some people, like that is their core mission, is to just feel good. I like running. So like when I go for a really good run, that runner's high situation, love it. It's great. But do my joints love me running every day? Absolutely not. So it's balancing things out. My objective with my training is to keep fit in a way that when I'm 87, I'd be able to get out of bed by myself, hopefully, like climb a flight of stairs. That sounds simple now, right? But if we don't train our bodies when we are younger and more able to do hard things, then we won't be able to do the things that are easy now when they're hard in our 80s and 90s. So it's just bearing that in mind, I think with their diversity of training, and this is the same thing with food, like different foods bring us different benefits. And so we mustn't get stuck on eating the same thing every single day, because we won't get the variety of benefits that our food can actually give us.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. So far then we've got the following stage. You've got the first 1,000 days.
Yeah.
We had 3 to 5 years of age. We had middle childhood, adolescence, early 20s, 30s, and then around middle age, around the 50s.
Yeah.
And that's where I went in with these questions. So let's keep going then.
You added in a 3 to 5 bracket, but I'll take it.
Oh, did I? Okay. All right. Forget that one.
But it's all the above. And then we've got what I refer to as Twilight Zone in my book, but it's also referred to as the Sniper's Alley, which I think is a bit harsh, but it's this it's a bit harsh, but it's this age bracket around 65, where you'll see people dying prematurely. So anything before the age of 70 for chronic disease is considered premature. And it's where you start to see people die quite suddenly, seemingly. So they will receive, they will have a heart attack, or they will have receive a diagnosis of cancer. Mm-hmm. And it's one of these where, especially for the more chronic, like with cancer, it's important to differentiate. There are certain cancers that have a very strong genetic factor that will absolutely manifest earlier in life, and it's got nothing to do with the lifestyle exposures, whereas there's other cancers that have a much bigger lifestyle contribution to their likelihood of happening. So classic example being lung cancer, bowel cancer as well. So in my book, I talk about my father who passed away from bowel cancer, and he was one of these people who was diagnosed with it aged 60, I think. Yes, so around the age of 60, and died by the time he was 63. And it's one of these things where like on paper he was healthy, but of course, like in hindsight as well, now you can see that his lifestyle and his diet was not supportive of good health. Mm-hmm. And so it's this Sniper's Alley. You want to avoid that. Like, nobody wants to pass away early, before they've retired, before they've seen their kids like have kids, all these things that you look forward to. And it's often, not always, but it's very often, these deaths are associated with lifestyle factors. So especially when we think about working with people in their midlife, it's really saying to them, look, if we change this now, we can drastically reduce your risk of this happening later. It's never a guarantee. So it's always really important to note that lifestyle factors, food, exercise, it's just one of the pieces of the puzzle for chronic diseases. And so I can't stress enough that it will be different. When I talk about this, people will say, oh, but I have a friend who's drunk all her life and smokes 60 cigarettes a day and she's alive at 96. Of course, like, everybody's different, but most of us, we don't know what our baseline risk is. Mm-hmm. So my advice is to act in a way that reduces risk, full stop. Now, you might be somebody who was already really low risk, and that risk reduction is fairly negligible. But you might be somebody who was high risk, and that risk reduction could be really good. And also, regardless of the outcome and your risk, you will feel better. Yeah. You'll feel better. So it's one of these things that, like, you're investing in yourself. So Sniper's Alley is a bit of a scary one, but it's also an important time where, if you do have a scare, so if perhaps you have sudden rise in blood pressure, or you see that there's, hopefully not as severe as a heart attack, but something happens, and often this does happen in this age, then it can be a wake-up call for people, and it can act as a real pivoting point to transform your health for the rest of your life, right? So that's why I call it Twilight Zone, because I think it can go either way. It can be like a positive change. Okay. It doesn't have to be Sniper, but it's a really important time. And there was a study that came out recently, just a few weeks ago, that pointed to the impact of dietary pattern on the risk of Alzheimer's and dementia in late 60s. And it made the headlines. It was the front page, but it's nothing new. Like, we already know that our behaviors and our diet in earlier time, like 40s, 30s, 40s, of course, impact our risk of disease in our late 60s, 70s. So it was really interesting to see how it really caught the imagination of the public, but it's nothing new. It's just when this particular research team had put a number on it, it's like age of 46, I think it was, like this is the strongest predicting factor. Your diet is the strongest predicting factor for Alzheimer's at 69. So it's very specific ages.
Wow.
And, you know, it's like, if that's what helps you to connect to the message of change, that's great. But it's important to remember that if you haven't changed your diet and you're like over the age of 46, that's fine. There's still plenty of time. There's so much evidence to show how you can improve your health and your outcomes if you change your diet in your 80s. So there's beautiful studies done in, retirement homes, and they will come in and do, like, my favorite is, I think it's called the New Age 2 trial. And they go in and they basically took a group of elderly adults who were sort of at the beginning of frailty. So frailty is this term that we use when people develop conditions that put them at higher risk of becoming really quite ill from a relatively minor occurrence. So people who are frail tend to be at higher risk of becoming severely ill from infections, but also from falls or changes in medication, for example. And the problem with frailty is that recovery is very unpredictable. So if you have a frail older adult, they might have a cold, get really, really sick, and really then not fully recover their independence. So we want to avoid frailty. And in this trial, they took this group of older adults and they gave them a Mediterranean dietary intervention, and they measured their frailty markers. And it was just transformational within a few weeks. They'd reduced their frailty markers. They measured gut microbiome changes that showed that some of these markers had changed thanks to mediation by the microbiome. It was beautiful. There's lots of studies like that, and lots of modeling studies that show us that if you change your diet at 70, you can still add 6 years to your life potentially, right? So
wow,
yeah, really,
six years to your life. If you make substantial changes to your diet at 70, you can add 6 years to your life
potentially. Yeah. So that's, it's a really empowering message. And so that's why there's a sniper sally. And then the last part of my book is actually really looking at this older age where many of us are going to live to be over the age of 75, right? And the life expectancy is going up. We'll have more centenarians than we ever had before, all these wonderful things. But we also know that there's a big health gap, especially for women. We can expect to live the 20 years of our lives in poor health. And actually, that doesn't sound so fun, right?
No.
I'm all up for longevity, but I want to live well. I don't want to just live long, because that's not fun for me, and it's not fun for my kids if they have to look after me, or my husband, or anyone else. So I think it's really important to think about older adulthood, first of all, with the overriding principle that aging is a privilege and it's not afforded to everyone. So it's not about anti-aging, but it's rather, how can we support ourselves to get the privilege to actually age, because not everyone gets that, and B, how do we help ourselves to age in a way that actually brings us joy, so that we can play with our grandkids, that we can climb the stairs, that we can get out of bed, that we can tie our shoelaces, and that we can cook. So it's that's really the aim of the final part of the book, is looking at the science behind how we can really support the older people in our lives in a way that can make them feel great. And food, food and hydration in later life is so important.
Yeah.
Partly because of this higher risk of frailty, that when you change something at that age, if you are frail, like, it has a real catastrophic impact. It's not just like you don't just feel a bit wobbly, it's like, it's actually much more severe. So yeah, that's the whole life course.
Thank you for summing that up so beautifully and clearly and succinctly.
Hi friends, Nick here with just a brief interlude to share with you an update on one of our newest partnerships with the Anti-Fragile Academy. Throughout John and I's conversations with many, if not most, of our guests, one thing has been made really clear. In order for people to flourish, thrive, experience the good life, they need to develop the capacity to not only navigate and endure, but ideally grow from the bad, grow from unpleasant experiences. That's why we're thrilled to be partnering with our newest sponsor, the Anti-Fragile Academy, an organization that I co-founded with Dr. Adam Wright, Director of Mental Performance for the Washington Nationals. At the Anti-Fragile Academy, we work with adolescent athletes, executives, and educators to help them understand some of the science, not just of optimal performance, but of well-being and anti-fragility. The ability not only to endure and bounce back from unpleasantness, but to actually come back stronger, to grow from it. Between Adam and I, we've worked with Fortune 100 companies, Inc. 300 executives, Division I programs, and elite professional athletes and Olympians from all over the world. To find out more about how you can leverage anti-fragility training, check out our website at theantifragileacademy.com.
So the last stage then is it sounds like the longest stage, the twilight zone, which you've renamed rather than Sniper Alley. Sniper Alley begins around midlife, but doesn't really end. That goes on till the end of life, right?
Well, I think Sniper Alley, in the research, it's really when it's like it's a time of life where you see individuals drop at an age where others are still surviving. So it's more, as you get older, your likelihood of dying increases, obviously, right? So that's nothing new. The Sniper's Alley is really referring to this premature death. So before, I'd say like, mid 60s to early 70s, because after that, you actually death rate. So I do go through some of it, but death rate does go up. So there's like a clear increase in the likelihood of death. Which then doesn't make it so much Sniper's Alley as just there's more groups of people.
Of
You know
course.
what I mean? It's like more common to suffer with a chronic disease. But you also still don't. The idea would still be that if you do reach your 80s, you don't want to have spent the past 15 years in poor health, though.
No, of course. Okay, so Sniper Alley is the penultimate period of life. Yes. After that, was the Twilight Zone the period after that, or your alternative phrasing?
I just prefer, it's still time. Okay. I prefer Twilight Zone to Sniper's Alley as a term. It seems a bit harsh.
Okay, so then there's the final stage after Sniper's Alley. Great, thank you. Okay, there's many things I want to dig into here. Let's go back to one of the first concept you brought in, actually, which is so important. You brought in this worrying statistic. It was ultra-processed foods.
Yeah.
Right, so let's first define these. So in your book, you define this as industrially made, pre-packaged foods with artificial additives that would be impossible to make at home, right? And another point you make is that UPFs, as we'll call them, are things that are really moreish, but don't tend to fill you up. Like you just keep wanting more of them. They don't make you full, like jelly babies, for example, right? Sweets, crisps, maybe, right? And I just clarify not being able to make it at home. So I had a conversation about this with a friend of mine earlier this week. He's a smart scientist as well. And I said, okay, it's something that's impossible to make at home. And I said, for example, crisps. And she said, well, you can make crisps at home. I was like, oh, okay, jelly babies then. So just to clarify, something like crisps wouldn't qualify as a UPF, but something like fruit pastels would.
Yeah, really good question, because so where the Nova classification system, which brought this term to us in research and invented the term, is really useful for research. So when you're looking at like dietary data and nutritional data for countries, the Nova classification is an easy way to categorize food intake, but it's not actually super intuitive for the shopper. So the reason I said that you couldn't possibly make it at home, in my way of trying to help define that for a reader who's going to go to the supermarket later, is that you can absolutely make your own potato crisps at home. But if you tried to make Pringles at home, you wouldn't be able to. So there's some foods that are just like what you might call junk foods or snack foods that aren't necessarily like super nutritious, but they serve a purpose of fun or joy or just because you fancy it. Now, arguably, a skin-on homemade crisp actually does have some nutritional value, although it wouldn't be an everyday food. Whereas like an ultra-processed food product like Pringles or like Doritos, it's not about the brand. It's just about if you look at the ingredients to make them and the process to actually make the shape and make them, you would never be able to recreate that at home. I mean, and people could try and probably do a fairly good job, but it's not something you would easily be able to recreate.
Gotcha.
So that's where they're like, and of course, fruit pastel is another good example, but there's so many other foods that people won't necessarily think of. So like breakfast cereals.
Yeah.
That can't
Like
really
Cheerios.
hard to make them. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, making
really
Cheerios
hard.
at home.
Exactly. And I think it's also important to, like, if there is a homemade alternative, so baked beans, classic example. If you look at a tin of baked beans in the supermarket, they might have ingredients you would never have at home.
Mm-hmm.
But you can quite easily make baked beans at home.
Yeah.
So where there is that option, then it would be so great to take that alternative.
Yeah, and it's
But
much healthier to do
much
that.
healthier. But this is where like we're doing some market study at the moment to really untangle this to help shopping behavior, because if baked beans is the only way that you're eating beans in your diet at the moment, the last thing I would want you to do is to cut them out because beans are so important for health, right? And for many people, baked beans are the only beans they eat. So there is a sort of a ranking of ultra processed foods where some of them can be functionally useful, like in someone's diet. So a similar example is like a wholemeal bread. If you're in a position where wholemeal bread is how you're able to feed your kids,
Mm-hmm.
like a relatively healthy, like a hummus and vegetable sandwich, then demonizing the wholemeal bread is not going to help you feed your family better. So it's just, we have to come up with a way that there's so many factions, there's so much fighting, and actually my approach to this is what can we do that will help improve people's lives and their health, because we can argue about the science and we can, have conversations about that, but at the end of the day, we've seen that a high ultra processed food consumption results in poorer health, right? It's associated. Results in is a strong word. There's not enough randomized clinical trials, but it's so hard to do those for this kind of thing. There's a few, and there's very strong association data from population studies. So if the general consensus, we all agree that people should, on average, reduce their intake, not 0%, but reduce, then making the advice approachable in a way that says, if it's a UPF and a junk food, please try not to buy it. If it's a UPF that has some form of beneficial sort of a beneficial quality to it, whether that's because it has beans or because it's high in fiber, then consider having it, but see if you can make your own. So there's got to be a scale. It's not just monochromatic.
Yeah.
And I think having this like very black and white view can be really hard for most people to actually do anything with. Yeah.
No, I understand. Thank you. That's useful clarification. And you described a startling statistic earlier, and you described many in your book. So 65% of children's daily energy comes from UPFs, and 70% of the food produced for our supermarket shelves is ultra processed in the US and the UK.
Yeah.
Now, that's massive, right? And really worrying. So what strategies do you recommend for people to eat less UPFs when these things are so abundant, available, and really well marketed?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step is being aware. So being aware of the marketing, walk around your supermarket and have a look at how well displayed all the UPFs are with their beautiful labels. So I think awareness often brings a bit of rage, which is good. In this case, we want to have a little rage around it. And then start to read the back of pack. So don't just look at the front of pack. Labeling is often actually unhelpful because it'll have the marketing claims that the ultra processed food product is allowed to make. And so that's where you get like a source of calcium, added vitamin D, good for your bone health, all these kinds of claims, which don't tell you anything about the quality of the food. They just tell you that their companies have put enough of something in to make that claim. So look at the back. If the ingredients list is filled with ingredients that you just don't have no idea what it is and would not know where to buy, that's a very obvious red sign that it is an ultra processed food. And I think, when it comes to actually making a difference, voting for people who care, politicians who care about food environment would be great. It's not really high on anyone's list in the US or the UK, which is a shame. So we have to remember that we as buyers hold huge power. If we stop buying certain foods in as many quantities from supermarkets, the supermarkets will stop stocking them because they're not going to make money. And if the supermarkets stop stocking them, the food manufacturers are going to have to do something. So in a way, we can actually have a big influence on the food environment with a grassroots approach. And being aware, like I saw a statistic just 2 days ago that of the amount of advertising that our children are exposed to for ultra processed foods, it's something like 15 billion times a year.
Wow.
Now, so also we have to be aware that that's happening. There's no regulation on that at the moment. Obviously, that there should be. Other countries do have it. I'll leave that there. But if there is a way that you can help to reduce your child's exposure, whether that is reducing screen time, whether that is like paying for certain platforms to remove advertising, so that's you basically save them from being bombarded with the adverts. These things can help, but awareness is the first step. Read the back of pack. And then when you're buying an item, especially if it's a prepared meal or something that's very convenient, we've been sold convenience as a solution to all of our problems. Just stop and ask yourself, could I make this myself at home? Like, is it something I could make? Baked beans is an example, but so is roast chicken. So many people buy ready-made roast chicken because it's convenient. But the question then is that do you actually really need to do that? Or could you possibly put the roast chicken on for like 35, 40 minutes and then have that made at home? So there's a lot of barriers that have been put in place to tell us that we also don't have time. Everything needs to be convenient. And I think we need to reclaim that a bit. And I say that with so much compassion for people who have caring responsibilities, 2 jobs that have to commute an hour each way to work. Like, I understand that our lives are not super well set up to support us having time to look after ourselves, but we're also being marketed that truth. So it's like, where can we reclaim some of our time to actually buy the food we want to buy and cook for ourselves and our families, and giving that a go, really. And there's lots of books out at the moment that speak to this. So there's a book by a registered dietitian called, I've actually got it here, How Not to Eat Ultra Processed, Nicola Ludlam-Rain. She's literally written a whole plan on how to do it. There's a similar book by Melissa Hemsley, the chef. There's people really, there's more interest in this. And I think if we can shift that needle from like 70%, at the highest bracket, 70% ultra processed food intake to like 20, that's a huge shift. It will have an impact on your life. Doesn't mean you have to make everything from scratch. I'm not suggesting that we all make our homemade butter, but it will make a big difference. And it will probably bring you a lot more joy, because actually preparing food and then eating the food you prepared is way more satisfying than opening a packet and eating it.
Absolutely. And I mean, you point out in the book as well, countries that do have much lower UPF consumption, Italy and Romania, where it's about 15% of daily energy intake, right? 14%. Wow. Yeah. So we can learn a lot, I take it, from these countries. What are they doing? I take it they're doing some of the things you've mentioned. They're prioritizing buying non-ultra processed foods. But is there any other lessons we can learn from countries such as Italy and Romania about how to reduce this massively?
Yes, I think so. So obviously, I'm Italian, so I'm a bit biased, but I'm very proud of that statistic. But I think there's the first thing to say is that I don't think Italians themselves have done something that makes them more virtuous in any way. It's our government and our food culture is so ingrained that protecting it is part of like political will. It's really interesting when you look at it. So governments will always protect, like, for example, regionality of foods. We have like the DOP mark, which essentially means that certain foods can only be made exactly where they're from. So Parmigiano Reggiano is an example of that. So we're very proud of our food culture, but that means that policies are in place to safeguard farmers selling fresh produce, and essentially the bar is quite high for us to import foods for sale to the public. So it's actually structurally, there's also it's way easier to access fresh produce. Like there's farmers markets that in London you might get once a week, and they're pretty shishy. Actually, they're not necessarily fresh produce. In cities, even like Rome, the capital, you have fresh produce to buy from the actual producers like every day in the same place at super cheap prices. So it's extremely affordable and easy to access fresh local produce. Here, there's way more barriers to that. So it's about the food system itself. And then it's also, as I said, reclaiming that actually I'm going to take 20 minutes out of my workday and make food. Like it's also that giving ourselves the benefit of taking the time out and preparing food, because it has such an important impact on our health. So it's a little bit of a mindset shift. I think as a population, we've lost touch in the UK with our food culture. We don't value it in the same way anymore. And I think that's partly, as I said, been propagated by this convenience culture. You don't see countries like Italy or Spain or France that also have lower consumption. People don't walk around drinking their lunch. I'm not going to name the brand, but it's just not a thing. Like people don't do that. Okay. Here, certain offices, they have fridges for it. And you can, like 80% of the workforce is drinking their lunch at the desk. It's just not, we need to reverse from that situation.
Right. So drinking your food is bad, not just because, is that because of the way that eating, just that the act of eating, for example, actually using your jaw to eat is good, and that you're reducing the likelihood of eating whole foods when you drink your food? Is that the reason it's bad?
So, I mean, so many. So I think, first of all, again, you're denying yourself that break in the day to actually stop, sit down, give your brain time. So when you prepare food, the messages that your brain sends to your stomach to prepare for eating, like all of that is, but actually we've evolved to spend most of our day looking for food, then to eventually find some, and then to sit down as a group and eat it socially. So when you look at this from an evolutionary standpoint, we've gone from spending our entire lives trying to source food and then eating it as a group to essentially completely removing that and drinking our food. So there's that physiologically, we have also not evolved to drink our food. So now I have to caveat this with, there are certain medical conditions, which means that you need parenteral nutrition. And of course, that is different. And that will, of course, be managed by medics and everything else, dietitians. But when we're talking about people who can eat food, there's a big difference between eating your food, sitting down at a normal pace, and the way that is then absorbed. So our food travels down into the stomach. There's mechanic digestion. If you've just drunk it, there's no need for any of that. And then once it gets to the small intestine, absorption into the liver is supposed to be paced. So it takes a while for it to go through from the stomach, and then a bit more gets let through, right? When you drink your meal, all of the amino acids, also all the protein, all the fat, all the sugar, everything just goes straight into the liver. And your liver is like, what?
Right.
I have not evolved to receive this amount of all of these ingredients, nutrients in one go. Like, it's just not how we evolved to eat. And I feel really strongly as well about the social aspect. We live in a world where mental health is a real problem. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that human connection is a must, right? Now, if you take away connecting over food, which is like the number one way to share social time, because we all do it, we all have to do it, and as I said, we've evolved to do it. You're creating, again, another time where we're just by ourselves, probably looking at a screen, or just not engaging in, it's just, I can't honestly find a reason to recommend drinking your lunch ever, to be honest. Like, unless you're literally on the go, about to miss a flight, and you just need to. But even then, there's usually, if you're buying that, you can buy food, right? So it's there. There's so many layers of problems to it for me, and the way that I see it at a public health level, not just a nutritional level.
Right. Wow. Thank you very much for sharing that. So there's so many things I'd love to dig into here. But you specialize in individualized nutrition, and that's a big part of your work with Zoe, right? But before we potentially go into that, let's get clear also the fundamentals about nutrition, which you explain in the book, some of which you've touched upon so far, and you emphasize this. And you're right, what we need to thrive is already inside us, and we need to understand the basics in our individual selves. So what are the basics about nutrition that we should all know?
I love this question because I think the way I look at it is there's an analogy which is quite funny because it doesn't make sense, but bear with me. If you think of nutrition as a cupcake,
okay.
So it's because it's useful to think about it in layers, right?
Yeah.
So the cake of the cupcake is the base. And that is what you would think of for public health nutrition. So what are the basics of nutrition that we know are essential for health? That is the same for the majority of us. So we all need to have a diet that has adequate amount of nutrients, that has enough energy to sustain life, that has enough fiber, enough good quality protein, enough healthy fats. The simplest way to think about what that looks like is the Mediterranean diet. So if you look at the Mediterranean dietary pyramid, you will see what the best studied evidence-based dietary pattern looks like. And it is a majority of plants, including whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, herbs and spices, with some oily fish, some fermented dairy. So this is cheese, yogurt, kefir, a little bit of poultry, occasional red meat, if any, and then home-baked sweet goods like cakes or biscuits made at home. Water as the main drink, extra virgin olive oil as the main source of fat for cooking and dressing, and then the much contested glass of red wine, which we can come back to another day. But in the pyramid itself, those are the elements. And if someone were to ask me, nutrition is so confusing, there's no clear evidence of what's good for the majority. Not true. There is very clear evidence of what is good for the majority. And for me, the simplest way to help people find that is the Mediterranean dietary pyramid. So that's your cupcake cake. Without that foundation, you can't add any icing.
Right.
Because if you don't have the cake right, there's no point me telling you about the icing, right? Because what's it going to go on? So the icing is when we start thinking about stratification. So what we've just talked about, there's slightly different needs for children than there are for teens, than there are for young adults and midlife. You would tweak some of that foundational evidence to say, actually, we also know, for example, that in early childhood, bone formation is super important. So what calcium-rich foods can we add to really have the maximum impact on really good bone formation in early childhood? Okay, and then we're looking at teens. We mentioned iron. We know that girls start their menstruation will need more iron. What iron-rich foods can we really hone in on? That's the stratification. But if the base is not good, so if you have a really poor diet, me just telling you that you should focus a bit more on your iron when you start your period is not going to make that much difference, right? It might a little bit, but you need the foundation. And then the cherry on the cake is the personalization. And what we do at Zoe is the full cupcake, right? We offer through our membership, but also through our Zoe Science and Nutrition podcast, which is excellent. And, I know you're a fan, which is great. Through our newsletter, through our Instagram, we provide a lot of that cupcake cake bit, like public health, well-established nutrition information that will help people to thrive. But then what we can really offer with the personalized program is the cherry on the cake and the icing. And the reason why you need to do a test for that, for cherry, is because we need to understand how metabolically healthy you are to be able to make recommendations based on your metabolic flexibility, essentially. So what that means is that everybody is able to deal with what would be considered metabolically challenging foods. That basically means high fat, high sugar foods, right? As we mentioned, our body, we evolved to forage for food for a long time and then take our time eating complex carbohydrates, berries, tubers, maybe some meat in a social setting over a long time. So when we think about what is going to be challenging for our bodies is this high fat, high sugar, because it just wouldn't normally happen in nature. You don't get that from any plant or animal.
Right.
So what we do at Zoe is we offer you the chance to metabolically challenge yourself with these really high fat, high sugar cookies that have been clinically designed by our chief scientist, Professor Sarah Berry, and they are exactly the same for everyone. So everybody has the same testing process, which means that when we get your response through the continuous glucose monitor and the blood fat test, we're able to see like, okay, how well did your metabolism deal with that compared to hundreds of thousands of people, and specifically people your age, your sex. So how are you doing on that? And that information coupled with our gut microbiome test, and we won't have time to go into this today, but the gut microbiome composition is so important for maintaining metabolic health, for supporting good immune system function, and for supporting mental health. So what is your gut microbiome telling us about your current state? Also, the gut microbiome doesn't lie. If your gut microbiome composition is suffering, then something is definitely amiss in your lifestyle and diet. Diet is the most important factor. And so it's something that we can change. It's plastic, but it also really tells us where you're at in terms of your health and the things that are impacted by microbiome composition. And when we combine all that information, we can then say, okay, John, of course you should be eating legumes and beans and pulses and green leafy veg. But also for your specific metabolic profile and for your gut microbiome health, we really recommend you have more of this, you have more of this. Try and combine these foods together and just take it to that next level, essentially, of being able to eat in a way that will make you feel really good today, but also stand you in really good stead for that compound interest health outcome that we want to look forward to in our later life.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, Federica, so that's super helpful. So then let's just sum up then. The basics about nutrition that everyone should know, based on what you've just said, are?
Eat a diet that's rich in whole plants and fiber. So make half your plate filled with plants. Make sure you get a diversity of those plants. So just having like a mixed leaf salad from the supermarket every day is not going to do it. Really get used to eating beans, lentils, nuts and seeds, lots of different types of fruits and veg, maybe see what's seasonal, and have fun with it. Spices and herbs make things taste good. Being mindful that the majority of us, so 90% of adults, don't have the recommended 30 grams of fiber a day. So take it easy at first, because you will get a bit of bloating, bit of gas as your gut microbiome adjusts. Then really focus on the quality of the protein you're eating. Just having lots and lots of animal protein or protein supplements isn't what we mean by good quality protein. Getting this protein from plant sources is ideal for longevity and good health. So nuts and seeds, legumes, tofu, any kind of soy products are the sort of standout stars. So are whole grains as well. And then really trying to get colourful plants, fruit and veg in your plate. So eating the rainbow is an old cliche, but it works, because the polyphenols, which are these chemicals that make the fruit and veg colourful, have protective health benefits for us. And they also feed our gut microbiome. And then really look for healthy fats. So when you're choosing your foods, think about what healthy fats you're providing your body. By healthy fats, what we mean are omega-3 fatty acids, which are found in oily fish, or their plant precursor, ALA, which is found in nuts and seeds, and can be eaten like every day, literally, it should be. And then extra virgin olive oil is the best fat to cook and dress with. But seed oils can make good alternatives for milder flavors. So seed oils are not toxic. They are very helpful when we're dressing salads or when we want to use an alternative to extra virgin olive oil for the flavor profile. What we really mean by also improving dietary fat quality is we want to move away from saturated fats that are found in things like salami and ham and bacon and sausages. There's nothing wrong with having butter occasionally, but making butter the main source of your fat is going to be problematic for your heart health in the long term. So if you can, and really that's all wrapped into having a majority whole food diet. So most of these foods should be coming from the original food, whether that's fresh, jarred, tinned, or frozen. The actual whole food should be very obviously the main ingredient. So when you buy frozen blueberries. They're wonderful. They're so good for us, and they're much more affordable than fresh very often. That's all there is in that pack, and that's great to have. So really, really try. It's not going to be 100% of your diet, but making the majority of your diet whole foods is extremely helpful for our health.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thanks so much for listening to Flourish FM. We hope you enjoyed the content. Please be sure to leave us a 5-star review and hit that subscribe button wherever you listen to your podcast and on all major social media platforms.
And if you visit our website, flourishfmpodcast.com, you can sign up to our newsletter. We send out a weekly newsletter. First newsletter of every month, we share a long form blog, and every newsletter, every week, we share highlights from our previous episodes. Please hit subscribe on our website.